So hi everyone, and thank you for attending our first winter quarter event for the MS&E Career Collaborative Program. My name is Linda Esquivel, and I'm the Career and Affiliate Services Officer for the Department of Management Science and Engineering. It's my pleasure today to welcome one of our MS&E alums from the Management Science and Engineering Master's Program, Adib Kshirsagar. He graduated in class of 2013, and he is now the North American Insights Manager for Marketing and Solutions at LinkedIn. Prior to that, he was leading the team for the North American Insights team with Marketing and Solutions at LinkedIn. And he's also worked for Rocket Fuel Incorporated and a number of other companies. But I'll let him go ahead and continue this. So with no further ado, go ahead, Adib.
Today I want to take the time to just talk about the road ahead. We've all had quite an interesting year. And then as Linda mentioned, quick summary, I graduated from MS&E with my master's in 2013. I studied engineering before that, definitely felt like a hard pivot in some ways. Second, I'm the North America Insights Manager at LinkedIn for specifically marketing solutions. So I lead an analytics team, and my team basically helps all of the tech companies within North America who do any kind of digital advertising on the LinkedIn platform with their strategy using data. So you can think about it as like a strategic data team. So let's get into some of the perspective I'd love to share with you all today. First of all, let's kick off with, we made it to 2021. You should feel somewhat fortunate about that because there's a lot of people, almost 2 million people, cannot say this statement now, which is terrifying, and it's very unfortunate. It was definitely a resilience testing year. Even if I read somewhere which kind of resonated with me, which is that you don't have to get COVID to suffer from it, because we are suffering from the consequences of this pandemic, whether you actually got you actually got the virus or not. And so here we are. It's 2021. It's time to reset. Time to think about the road ahead. And the other reflection really is that post-COVID, several aspects of our lives will have permanently changed, especially the ones where crawling backwards isn't an option. And what I mean by that is there's certain movements within the world that tend to be fairly unidirectional. An example, and we'll unpack this a little bit further in the next few slides, is just the advancement of technology. We don't seem to live in a world where technology ever goes backwards. It either stays the same, stagnant in some aspects, or it only moves forward. And that's just one aspect. Several other ways in which our world is changing in a way that things don't seem to be going backwards. And so, interestingly, you can also think about COVID as sort of an amplifier, which means that it amplified the effects of certain trends that were already in place and really accelerated them. And some other things that were kind of on their way out, perhaps it decelerated them even further. So, as they say, COVID could be thought of as a great amplifier for things that we were already in the cycles of. In terms of what I'd love to share with you today, it's 5 reflections on the post-COVID world. There's some of the stuff that is very relevant to your careers and actually the way you think about your education, potentially jobs. But some of this stuff is just perspective on things that you can think about your life as well. And those are the kind of things that I often think hold true the most, which is things that resonate in multiple aspects of your life in similar ways tend to be the things that perhaps seem to be the most true. And so let's get right into it. The first one is the adoption of technology. Now, this is not at all surprising. We've kind of seen this across the board, which is COVID, if anything, in the last year has accelerated the way in which several industries, several businesses of various sizes, several countries, continents, and different fields of study have also embraced technology. And so, one of the big ones being the digitization of businesses, small and large, accelerated astronomically. So, on the right, for example, this is a McKinsey research that came out not too long ago, and it actually shows a percentage starting from June 2017 on the left to July of 2020. just about like a period of 3 years, what this trend of percentage of their offerings in digital format looks like. And you can see this massive jump that happens in July 2020. Intuitively, that makes a lot of sense. Embracing technology was a safety net and a competitive advantage for a lot of businesses. We can kind of see that at like the organization and enterprise level, but also you can see that just around you. You can think about the restaurants, your favorite restaurants that you'd go and pick up food from, the ones that had an online business set up where they could get online orders or online pickups or have food delivered to their customers. They seem to be able to navigate this pandemic better than the ones who had to construct it from the ground up and only had an in-person presence. So that's just one example of several ways in which the digitization and the online accessibility of services and products massively helped folks in the pandemic landscape. Third is the automation of historically human jobs has accelerated and will continue. So, we kind of started our talk thinking about how COVID was perhaps an accelerator. We know that the automation and the utilization of AI and machine learning to potentially automate more of the simpler and repeatable jobs that we tend to do in the workforce is a trend that has been playing out for several years now. I mean, in 2020, we had presidential candidates speak about this as some of their main talking points, which is that we have to future proof ourselves to automation, and our entire skill set and perhaps the way that we think about the world um, is on the cusp of changing. And that's not going to slow down. We talk about, how approximately every 2 years, computational power doubles. That's there's no inkling that tells us that that's going to slow down. It continues to be the case. And so the fact that automation and machine learning algorithms, hardware is going to get more sophisticated is a trend that continues to pervade our lives. And it's something that it kind of showed itself out in this pandemic as well. Again, we referenced some of the services that we felt were more accessible because of automation and perhaps technology. This continues to be the case. Um, and then the final one is technology served as a buffer and perhaps softened the blow from the pandemic. You may have seen a lot of narrative out in the media, in the news channels about how pandemic compared perhaps to the last time we had a pandemic approximately 100 years ago. That was also fairly devastating for the time and even by today's standards. Something that we did not have 100 years ago is the advancement of technology to the extent that we have today. And while we did have that, and it definitely mitigated some of the risks, this is something that is kind of a welcome contribution of technology to our society. Now, there is also a simultaneously parallel conversation about how technology is not always beneficial to society, that there may be instances where technology actually leads to the detriment of society. If any of you have seen, say, The Social Network, that's a really interesting movie on Netflix talking about how perhaps just our approach towards social media and how we interact with each other may be shredding the very fabric of society that has historically kind of maintained itself in a particular way. So, one of the things that I'd love to do through this talk in general is that while we are going to go through some of these learnings that we got, those five main reflections in the post-COVID world, perhaps a couple of thoughts from me on what this implies in terms of action items. What does it mean for us in terms of what we can take to this and apply to our lives? And so, with this first one, which is the adoption of technology, perhaps there's two takeaways that kind of come front and center to me. As you think about your future, anticipate that technology will be a constant disruptor. So when you work with it, when you invest in it, when you build it at some point, which in the future a bunch of folks here attending this talk may, um, let that be something that stays constant and kind of front and center, which is that technology will always continue to disrupt the way that we work. But if we anticipate it, we can prepare for it. And if we prepare for it, we can actually have an influence on how that happens, as opposed to it just having an influence on us. And then the second one is technology by itself doesn't have any morals. We talk a lot about in the media narrative, even you may have seen a lot of updates about potentially tech CEOs actually talking to the government and having been put on the spot about some of the things that they did. I think these are all very valid conversations, but something that is always good to remember is that as the folks who build the technology ourselves, technology is a creation that we've come up with. You can kind of think of it as like the most sophisticated version of tool building, and human beings are essentially tool building creatures. Technology by itself doesn't have any morals. We bring those morals to the technology. But it's good to know that whatever morals we bring to technology, it has real consequences. And so it's our approach really to building technology and how we think about it that defines the consequences that it has on society. So if we decide to apply technology in a particular way that is detrimental to society, those are decisions that are made by actual people. And it's really helpful for people to think about the consequences of those decisions. Very simple analogy that I use here is that a knife is a perfectly brilliant instrument for someone that is cooking up a nice meal in a kitchen, but it's also the same. It's also a same, like on a similar lines, is a tool that can be used to really hurt someone. So in that case, is the knife itself the holder of those morals, or is it the person that is using them? And that's something useful to think about when you think about technology. Next up is our relationship with nature and Mother Earth. So, this is something that has been a very huge piece of conversation for us as a society. So, of course, it applies at every level of analysis. We talk about this at, say, a country level where governments are passing policy with respect to this. This is a global conversation, something that a lot of people have strong feelings about in common with folks that live across the world, and things that even countries together, for example, the Paris Accord, are thinking about as a collective unit. But also as individuals, it applies, it goes down, to our very individual lives as well, which is how do we think about our own individual relationships with nature? What are the effects that we have in the way that we live personally on this beautiful planet that we've gotten the privilege to live on? And learnings here, for example, is that Earth had a little bit of relief last year. I know that there was a lot of videos on social media, TikToks, about how Mother Nature was kind of creeping back into our habitat, into, I guess, technically her habitat, and reclaiming some of it. And it was kind of endearing and encouraging to see. What do the numbers say? For example, in 2020, this is recent research that just came out start of this year, that American greenhouse gas pollution fell 10.3%, which is actually a pretty solid decline, the largest year over year drop since the Second World War, so about like 60, 70 years. So, what did we learn from that? Is that the Earth had a little bit of relief, but is that little bit of relief something that we can sustain? And it doesn't seem so. The backdrop of where we are heading as a collective society is still pretty grim. Climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and habitat loss is a pretty significant challenge. If the COVID pandemic was not at all in the picture in 2020, and neither was politics, perhaps the biggest piece of news would have been the very way in which we started the year, which was millions and millions of square miles of forest land in Australia burning down in ways that it did not before. This is a picture from San Francisco. As you know, I've been living in the Bay Area for 10 years now, and I've never seen a sky like that. I don't know that this is an anomaly that just kind of stands out. I think this is a result of a progression that we are heading into, where our situation with respect to the climate is getting worse. The second learning is that we saw this pandemic coming, and actually with acute precision. You may have seen old videos of President Barack Obama talk about how in the future, perhaps in 5 years or less, which was kind of ominous, that we may have a virus that we would have difficulty controlling. Bill Gates has been talking about this for several years, and the essential need for organizations and governments and individuals to think about preparing for something like this. So, while it really took all of us by surprise, something that perhaps a lot of experts in the field may have already called a long time before. It was just up to us as a collective on whether we chose to believe them and take them seriously or not. Third is that the climate will be more unpredictable. From our best estimate, this is actually one of the 17 professors that did a recent study on this that I was reading about this past weekend. One of them is actually from Stanford University, and their estimate collectively as a group of experts is that the climate will become more unpredictable, and it'll cost a lot to manage. So we do, as a society, within the political conversation, within the industry, talk a lot about what is the effect that our work and our policies are having on the planet. And one of the constant things that we hear about a lot is that we don't have the money to solve this problem. How are we going to generate all of this capital to be able to justify the changes we need to make in order to save our climate? And the interesting argument is that, well, it's not that us not solving those problems does not cost anything. And this cost is going to keep on increasing. And in my own personal view, perhaps we should be investing all of that money in ways to better this home that we live in. And then the last one is that there is a general sentiment to solve this crisis. I think perhaps now more than ever, while there is a ton of resistance to these ideas, as there generally tend to be resistance to major broad ideas, there is the intent, large scale intent across several millions of people, a good portion of the world's population, to solve this crisis. I think what comes next, we're in that limbo between perhaps action and intent, where we have the intent, but perhaps the actions have not yet been put into place. Uh, I generally tend to be an optimistic person, cautiously optimistic person, not naively so. And I do believe that if we really did decide as a collective society, we could um, make something significant happen that could help us out. But that being said, I don't know that we should run with that assumption and just kind of leave it on someone to take care of it, because I think we do all play a part. And so, in terms of takeaways, the one big takeaway that is kind of a hard pill to swallow is that the reality is that the planet will be just fine. 99 plus percentage of every species of life that has lived on this planet is now extinct. And that is the cycle of nature, but the planet is still here. The planet is just going to be fine. We're putting ourselves at risk. I think that a lot of people know this, but I don't know that they necessarily really feel it or perceive it, which is that if we don't solve this climate crisis, the climate and the planet is going to live on beyond us. It's just that we will not be able to live on in that journey. We're going to drive ourselves to extinction. And funnily enough, as a lot of philosophers say, we may be the only species that may have lived on this planet to consciously know that we drove ourselves to extinction, which is a very grim picture to think about. And I hope we don't have to get there. Society knows this, as I said, but we don't really feel it, which is the fact that the planet's going to be fine, but we may not. What can we do about it? What we can do about it is help facilitate the conversation, give your worldview a bigger voice. We spoke about intent and action. I often think that it's up to us to facilitate this conversation. It's up to us to have this constantly on people's minds, because the likeliness of someone being more motivated to come out and bring novel solutions to be able to solve these problems uh, is higher if we continuously have conversations. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to hear talk about this big challenge that we all collectively face as well. And then the second one is, we're constantly voting. There's this notion that once every 2 years at certain levels and once every 4 years, you should go in and cast your vote and then vote for the people who will, reflect your beliefs and your policies if you want to really make any change. And everything outside of that is mostly uh, pretty insignificant in terms of what an everyday person can do to the bigger picture. I do not believe that to be true at all. I think we're constantly voting every day, several times a day, often, and we're constantly voting with our dollars. The things that you buy, the things that you choose to invest in, the things that you choose to work on, in some ways, are things that you do because you get something in return, but in some ways are also stacking up, I guess, the coins or the cards on ideas, competing ideas within the world. And so remember that, vote wisely. Be mindful of the things that you purchase, be mindful of the things that you use, be mindful of everything that you consume, everything that you decide to waste, because all of these things, with billions of people on this planet, in small ways, adds up very significantly over periods of time. Next is the nature of work. So I know a lot of like curious questions potentially on this topic. How is work changing? And the answer is yes, it is significantly changing quite a bit. The interesting thing is the way that we work has changed, it continues to change, but it has changed differently for different professions. So I would imagine that, for folks such as myself, the disruption in the way that we work was perhaps not as significant as perhaps the ways in which a lot of people work that have to be in person, for the things that they do, have heavy amounts of people interactions, have heavy handling of physical machinery, take physical effort, um, and as I said before, the COVID pandemic is kind of like an accelerator, and what it has done is that it has accelerated this gap. So this is something that we talk about a lot, which is for the folks that are able to continue with their day to day and their jobs and their lives just from working from home. I would actually consider myself as one of them. um, we should be incredibly privileged and thankful for the fact that we can do that, because that is not the luxury that a lot of people have. So the nature of work in itself is changing. Communication tools are having their moment, and it'll be longer than a moment. um, as one of the funny things that we see is, of course, that the stock market tends to be a reflection of the businesses that are trying to add value, are adding value in these kind of scenarios. If any of you have been keeping track of, say, the stock price of Zoom as a company, the very tool that we're actually having this webinar on, you may have seen that the amount that we invest in these kind of tools and this kind of technology infrastructure has restructured because of our needs. And that kind of has a small lesson in itself as well, which is, as the creators of technology, us collectively as human beings, our society, as the investors in society, as the folks who can entirely choose the path of what these tools do, a lot of this is in our control. And communication tools at this moment are something that we've, of course, recognized that is something that we need to invest in, and we need better off if we need to be able to continue doing what we do. Third is that the employer's approach to the pandemic factors into their ability to attract talent. Now, this kind of speaks a little bit to a broader trend that in general we see in the workforce. I work at LinkedIn, for example, and LinkedIn is one of the biggest platforms in order to be able to get jobs in the world. And we have a ton of learnings and insights on this topic in general. One of the big things that we see as a continuous trend is that more than ever, and continually so, the newer generations that are entering the workforce, folks such as yourselves attending this talk, um, highly value, more than previous generations perhaps, the ethics, the morals, and the values of a company, and the amount that they invest in their employees, and the amount of thought that they put into the lives of their employees, and not just their the hours that they spend at work. This is a new paradigm in which we are operating. And I think it's a positive paradigm if it were for itself, which is the fact that, given that we each approximately, once you're in the workforce, you spend approximately one third of your awake time within a year at work, just working. And that's being conservative, not taking into account things like you may actually be putting in extra hours and wanting to work on something outside of work hours and things like that. If we take a very conservative estimate, you spend 1/3 of your entire time awake at work. So in my view, it's imperative that these companies, the entire workforce, just in general, when we think about the professional community, invest in their employees. This is 1/3 of somebody's life. And so increasingly so, this is on the right. You see that this is research by Salesforce, and they kind of ranked the most important employer actions during COVID-19 as ranked by employees. And first, of course, was demonstrating trust in the employees. Second, regular communication, earning your employees' trust, flexible work schedules, flexible work locations, things that allow us to be productive on our own terms as members of the professional workforce. I see that as a positive change. I see that as a continuous change. I don't know that we would go backwards. We were talking about, we started this talk again uh, with the idea that COVID has set into motion, especially the things that will not be able to go backwards, and this is one of those as well. I don't really foresee a world in which a more flexible, a more employee friendly, a more productive environment where there's a stronger cohesion between an employee's individual values and the company's collective values. Um, if we operate in a world like that, I don't really see us going back. If this seems like a unidirectional movement, how far along we can go in this one direction, that's to be seen. But I definitely don't see us going back. And then the last one, which I wanted to say, which is an observation, which is that being digitally adept and equipped has jumped up ranks in the abundant list of skills that employees need in the workplace. And I don't just mean that for folks who work, say, at tech companies or in the corporate world of finance companies or consulting companies. I mean this universally. If, say, someone is working, on delivering Amazon packages, there's a much higher level of technology that is involved in their work now as well. They have to do a lot of tracking for the way that they deliver goods. They have to provide like picture proof of some of the things that through your Amazon will get sent to you as proof of things that are happening. There's a lot of like digital logging of like data that happens. And so the average baseline of being able to just be digitally very functional is increasing across the board, across all fields. So, takeaways here are that businesses will be global, always open, more digital, and more flexible. This is a direct result of the digitization of businesses and products across the world. Identify and hone the skills that prepare you for this trend. As we said earlier, we're not going to go backwards on this, we're only going to go forward. So, if you were to reflect on this for your own individual career and education, what does this mean to you? That's a really good question to ask yourself. What does it mean to your own digital skills and capabilities moving forward? How is it that you can better equip yourself for a future where we're heading towards a more cohesive and digital environment? Second, is that simple, repeatable tasks are the ones that will go first. And then what I mean by go first is not that they won't get done, it's just that they will be automated. We all have been perhaps in loop with the news about Tesla with their big mission, not only to actually like disrupt the utilization of perhaps fossil fuels in the automobile industry, which I think is a major movement globally if we could undertake it. But secondly, they're really well known for their automation capabilities, and at some point they would love for you to just stop driving. All you have to do is sit in a car, and things will drive you to wherever you want to go. And that's something to think about as well, which is the things that we think are more simple and repeatable and we do all the times are the things that are going to be identified to first get automated. So what does this mean for us and you as you think about your future? It means that you should get comfortable with ambiguity, with complexity, and creativity. Why? Because those three things are things that we have not yet figured out how to automate effectively. And the timeline on how we could automate that effectively also seems unknown. We're not entirely sure that we're going to be able to automate certain creative tasks. I don't know that you'd ever be able to automate the job of an artist. I don't know that a machine would be able to conjure up something that is really resonant with someone that is truly inspired by art, because art is such a human phenomena. Music is such a human phenomena. So while we could use automation and AI in the process of assisting us in these things, I don't know that they could take over for all of them. Next is increasing complexity. So this is an interesting one because 1 year ago, I think Linda may remember this as well. In January of 2020, before the pandemic had kind of like really hit us and everyone was really aware of it, there was no lockdown yet. I was on Stanford campus to do a talk in person, and I extensively spoke about this one topic. But I kind of wanted to summarize it here as one of our talking points today as well, because I still think, 1 year down and one pandemic later, and not quite later, we still feel, I think, in my view, that this tends to be resonantly true. And in my view, if we were to think about this 1 year down from now as well, it'll still continue to be true. Is that we live in a world where complexity is increasing. In my view, I don't really see this as an optional trend. I think this is inevitable. We just tend to live in a world where complexity by itself tends to be increasing in magnitude, and it doesn't tend to be doing that linearly. It tends to be doing that exponentially, which is terrifying because the amount of things that would potentially happen in any given system. So you can think about that within a country, within a company, at the global scale, within society. In any given system, the amount of complexity, when increasing exponentially, um, that kind of takes us to a point where things are going to happen so fast and so frequently that it's going to be really hard to keep track. So even before we kind of like expand on complexity a little bit, it's kind of, I want to touch on this idea of complexity because again, like through a lot of my reading and podcasts that I listen to, I've heard several philosophers, actually mathematicians, also speak about complexity, this idea of complexity. I would say on average this is not something that people reflect on much. If you ask, say, a random person on the street that you met and say like, hey, define complexity for me, you won't really get a satisfactory answer. The most common answer that you'd get is like, I don't know, something that's not simple. And that's not an answer in itself. That's just stating the opposite of it and saying that, here's what it's not, here's what complexity is not. And I don't know that that's a very satisfactory answer. One of the more satisfactory answers that I've heard about complexity is the state or quality where a high number of connections exist between parts of a system. So let's expand that a little bit because it's a really helpful way to think about complexity. So what I mean by that is in any given system, there's several components and moving parts. In my view, from a very practical perspective, a simple system is where each part kind of has its own rules, laws, or mechanisms by which it functions. And it's not necessarily related with the things that work in tandem with it. Whereas in a complex system, the converse of that is that several moving parts and several moving factors are interdependent in a complex system, which I found is a really useful way to think about it. And it's useful because it's actually very practical. It helps with your day-to-day jobs. It helps with the way that you think about your education. Sometimes if you're thinking about your program, like your degree, as you're thinking about your major, you're thinking about how do each of the courses that I am taking on within a given year or a given quarter, how do they play with each other? Do they play with each other at all? How does this whole thing tie into one kind of like cohesive picture? And I think complexity has something to do with that. Complexity is basically a situation where every part in some ways is dependent on some other or several other parts. And the more complex a system is, the more interdependent every part is on every other part. And this is a really interesting way to think about it because grasping this concept helps you understand organizations better, helps you understand teams better, it helps you understand projects better. It helps you understand sometimes the things that you are working on yourself better. And so when we think about complexity, I'd urge you to look at the two pictures on the right. So this was actually two slides that I did in my presentation last year, still holds true. 15 years ago, when you think about these six different industries, so we have, starting from the top left, we have social media, and you kind of go clockwise, we can go down to like media. Social media at the time, MySpace was the hot topic and the hot platform at the time. Media, everyone knew about Netflix at the time, but very much in isolation. Mercedes-Benz, the very peak of automotive technology. E-commerce, eBay. Consumer tech, Microsoft, HP laptops and Microsoft Surface like laptops. Google, artificial intelligence. Everyone associated Google's like search algorithms with AI and how sophisticated and interesting things were. Let's now look at today, 15 years later. So going from say 2005, 2006 to 2021. When you think about social media and e-commerce, Facebook does that for you. It's on one platform that you have, like say the Facebook marketplace. You can actually have an extensive marketing and advertising and purchasing network on Instagram if you felt like it. But it's also social media, interestingly, ways in which we just connect ourselves. Think about media and consumer tech. So Apple, of course, one of the biggest companies when it comes to personal device electronics and consumer tech. Apple TV, they're actually making their own movies. They're actually making their own shows. They're in the media business now. If you would have told that uh, these connections would be made to someone 15 years ago, they'd probably laugh you out of the room. If you would have said that, oh, you know what, there is going to be, forget Microsoft and forget Netflix, there's going to be a company that's going to actually do both. People would be like, what? So that's kind of an unforeseen trend. And similarly, I would say we could end with the example of Tesla. It's like automotive technology. Tesla makes incredible cars, but they're at the very cutting edge, at the very forefront of artificial intelligence to do self-driving technology. So it's like, who would have made that connection? And again, like, the inverse is also true. It's like we use Google as an example of AI. Google's been uh, you know, Google has acquired Waymo, which is a self-driving car technology. You'll see them driving all around the bay. They're getting in that business as well. So, what does that mean? Kind of going back to our learnings, complexity is increasing exponentially. And why is that happening? Due to the internet, due to the computational power doubling every 2 years, which is kind of what we touched on earlier as well. Um, Drop in absolute poverty across the globe. So I know that whenever you turn on the news and whenever you turn on uh, any of, say, like the social media, it's like everything is doom and gloom and everything's coming to an end. And yes, we do have a lot of challenges across our society. But think about it this way: the internet has directly played a role in the last 10 years to pull 1 billion people, that's about 1/7, 1/8 of the world's population, out of absolute poverty. Do we have a lot of work to do on this topic? Of course, yes. But now there's all of these people who can now participate in the social conversation, who have a role to play in how the world works. And this increasing complexity feels like a natural kind of trend, given that there's 1 billion more people in the mix. And so, our last learning being, if with the progression of time, complexity is going to increase, what can we do about that? What we can do about that is, first of all, accept this trend, accept that more in like seemingly unconnected things will connect at some point in the future. And I think, in my view, it's personally very powerful to know that. Why? We'll talk about that on the next slide. In terms of our takeaways, anticipating complexity equals seeing connections between unconnected things if they make sense. Going back to our previous example, uh, the kind of, say, connection that Tesla made between artificial intelligence technology and good cutting edge automotive technology. Does that make sense as technology grows? And I think, of course, it makes sense. There's a huge portion of people who drive cars that actually love driving cars, but there is a substantially larger population, perhaps, of people who don't necessarily view driving as something that they want to spend their time doing. They see it as a chore, they see it as a means to an end. There's a lot of people who would rather not commute an hour to work every day and drive to work every day and use that time somewhere else. So, is there a need? Yes. Is there, with growing technology, a way for us to do that? Yes. And all really Tesla has done is, in the right way, identified that connection and then capitalized on it, right? So, that's something to really think about, which is really powerful. As you think about your own future, um, and everyone says, well, how do you come up with a startup idea? You know, how do you come up with the next big thing? And I'm not advocating necessarily that you should come up with the next big thing. Startups are very challenging and it's a lot of work and they have a very low likelihood of success. So if I had to go by the numbers, I don't know that I would recommend it to every single one of you, though I would say you would go on a journey of your lifetime and I would highly encourage it. But something to think about is, how do you come up with the next best idea? Perhaps just an idea is to anticipate a connection that someone has not yet made and then be able to successfully execute on it. That's something to think about. And then the second one is, we can't evolve as fast as our machines. That seems to be a reality. With computational power doubling every year, we are biological carbon protein based beings. We cannot evolve as fast as the machines we build are evolving. That's just a biological fact. Essentially, human beings have stayed genetically identical for about the last 150,000 years. So, unless we figure some way out to evolve into something else immediately due to some kind of technological breakthrough, which I don't really think we can, nothing's going to change. I think we will continue to be the same carbon base, essentially meat puppets, moving forward for several thousands of years, but our machines will not. So while we can't evolve as fast as our machines, we have each other. This is something that the machines necessarily cannot do yet, which is, we have the power of language, we have the power to collaborate, we have the power to literally, quite literally, dream up new things that did not exist and make them manifest. This was an old philosophical idea from a Greek philosopher that, there was a period of time in the arc of history, small tangent, where a lot of philosophers tried to figure out, how do we best define human beings. So, we currently call ourselves, in the scientific verbiage, we call ourselves Homo sapiens. And what that essentially translates to is that we are logical beings. So, essentially, people who think rationally and can make logical decisions. I think that's a fair classification, but that's not the only, um, Homo that we have defined ourselves to be. There's been several other definitions for human beings that are not Homo sapiens. And one of them was, we are tool building creatures. And what tools allow us to do is quite literally manifest in the real world, in the real physical world, something that did not exist outside of our imagination before. We don't see that in the animal kingdom. You could make the argument that perhaps, honeybees do that. Of course they do. They build beautiful, like, symmetrical structures of webs. Sorry, not webs. They're honeycombs to store their honey. Spiders do that with webs. Ants do that with anthill colonies. So there is small examples of nature who do that, but really humanity over the course of time have literally imagined things and then make them happen. And this is something that we will continue to be able to do. And so the future is very exciting. As long as we have the audacity to imagine something, we likely will find a way to do it if enough people decide to do it. And so that's something to think about as well, which is, we can't evolve as fast as our machines, but we can create things that don't even exist yet. And that's something useful to know. Don't be afraid to use your imagination, because you never know what it may result in. And then our last of the five pillars is our relationship with uncertainty. So this is kind of a broad, vague one. I don't know necessarily that it applies specifically to your career, but this is just a really useful thought that I've thought and reflected on for a long time. And I've often felt that this is an idea that I would love for more people to think about, as reflecting on this can potentially give you some really interesting and actionable insights. for the way that you think about your career, but just about your life as well. With increasing complexity, which we spoke about for a little bit, the unknown is always at your door. And what that means is that for everything that you think that you know, there's several more things that you do not know, and several, perhaps, on the concept of connections, several connections that you have not made yet. But it's always good to know that this will forever hold true, which is the fact that you will not necessarily always be able to see connections between things. There's always things that you can't anticipate. And so the unknown is very, very close to the way that you think about the world. And knowing that fact and accepting that fact and kind of really feeling that fact actually does change the way you think about ambiguity, just change the way you think, approach your life, approach your career. And we'll kind of chat about that a little bit further down as well. Second is that the adversity that the unknown brings is best faced voluntarily because you can do it on your own terms. So I want to expand on this idea a little bit, which is the fact that we will have to confront things that we do not know or did not expect is forever true. You can take that and apply it to any aspect of your life, and you'll find that this statement tends to be true. That there's for sure things that you don't know. Second, at some point, you're going to have to confront them. When you do confront them, some of them actually may, if you're fortunate enough, just kind of work out. And that's perfectly great. And I think you should enjoy that and celebrate that and be happy about it. But simultaneously, also, all of the things that you face with respect to the unknown will bring adversity. We think about the pandemic in some ways as that. For a lot of people, they had to face consequences that they did not even see coming. They did not expect the pandemic. They did not expect that it would significantly affect the way that they think about their education, that they think about their jobs, they think about their livelihood, they think about their own health. And it was basically just like this wall of unknowns and the adversity that it brought that just kind of hit them very suddenly. But here's the idea being that if you know that you're going to face adversity and you're going to do it every time you face the unknown, one of the things you can do is that you can be the proactive driver of how you confront it, as opposed to having you be the consequences of it. And what I mean by that is, if there's some aspects of your life that you have self identified as like, that's something I don't really know. But perhaps as I think about the future and I think about my life and my career, perhaps if I did confront it, try and learn it, like, learn something new, pick up a new skill, anything of that sort, um, then I would be better prepared for the future. Now, the interesting thing here, and the one distinction I'll make, is that this is a voluntary approach. This is something that you yourself have decided to take on as a challenge. Now, the good thing about that is that you can do it on your own terms. You can decide the timeline with which you want to do it. So let's actually make this specific. We're going to talk a little bit about like lifelong learning, but it's like, suppose you want to pick up a new skill. There's a new tool, a new coding language. It could be anything, a new program that you want to learn. If you decide to take it on, you don't have to wait till the time that you do have to take it on, and it's forced on you, because then you can decide your timeline. It's like, okay, over the next 1 year, I want to learn SQL. I'm just using that example because I work in data. It's like, I want to learn SQL because I think it'll better position me for a career in data, which I'm passionate about, for example. Now, if you decide that you want to take on SQL, you can set your own timeline. You can say, okay, well, I'll set very lenient goals. Over the course of 1 month, I'll put in 4 hours, literally 1 hour every week. And I'll do this over 3 months and I'll have a basic knowledge. Now, that does not seem very taxing as compared to the alternative where it comes the time that you start applying to, say, data careers, and the immediate number one requirement in that job description is, yeah, we want someone that's proficient in SQL. So, what is the situation you've put yourself in there? You've gone into this interview, you have about a week before your interview, and in order for you to pass the bar for this interview, you need your SQL skills. And so now the fact that you have to learn SQL has been forced upon you. And you don't get to decide that timeline. That timeline is entirely decided by the recruiter or the company that you're speaking with. They've given you 1 week, that's all you got. You didn't decide that time frame. And what does that 1 week look like for you? Probably horrendous, because you're panicking about whether you'll clear this interviews. Interviews can be intimidating by themselves, but to do it with an unknown skill that you had to squeeze into your brain at the very last minute seems even more challenging. And so I'll summarize again that the adversity that we take on voluntarily, that's the one that can have biggest benefits.
Adib, we have a question from the audience.
Yes.
So Anish, just from Mumbai, India,
Mm-hmm.
he said, first off, thanks for the insightful session. My question to you is that how do you think your MS&E background helped you through the COVID and post-COVID uncertainties as well?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. And Anish, if you'd like, I'd finish this thought because interestingly, it kind of ties into perhaps what I'd love to share with you on that question. Um, so on our third point here, which is make yourself a lifelong learner, which is another interesting kind of learning, very relevant, somewhat counterintuitive to a group of people who are here as part of, say, like a degree or a program to hear this. But our entire education system, and I don't mean just the universities, I mean, from ground up, like from school up, is structured in a way that conveys the idea that once you're done with your college and once you're done with university, you're done learning. I mean, the focused part of your life that is dedicated to just learning is, for the most part, you're done. It's like, you've got about 90% of it wrapped up when you're out of university. You got your degrees. You can now go and tell people like, aha, I went through this entire process and now I know stuff. um, I don't agree with that notion at all. I think learning is a lifelong process, and anyone who has managed to rise to, say, perhaps a successful position in whatever they do will tell you this exact same thing, which is learning is a lifelong process. And the more you keep that up, the more you assimilate and the more you can apply and the more you can think. Uh, and then the last one is that, just to kind of wrap this up, is a really like fun line that I read, which is that if what we know is a fat book, what we don't know is an entire library. To think about the proportion between what we think we know and what we don't. And then this final one, a thought as well, which is we do not fear the unknown. We fear what we project onto the unknown. So we fear the adversity that we think the unknown is going to bring to us, not unknown itself, because the unknown is full, just like adversity. The unknown is full of massive, pleasant, and huge surprises, and that can have positive effects in your life. So Anish, like, let's address your question, which is, how did MSNE help you with something like a pandemic situation? I don't know that I would say that any specific degree. So we can talk about MSNE specifically, but I would generalize this. I don't know that any college degree or any MSNE degree or any specific university or master's degree can prepare you for, say, like specifically a pandemic. I don't know that it can do that. What, in my view, is really beneficial for college students and university students when you're in graduate school, and this is something that I kind of learned and kind of reflected on over a long time after graduating as well. I don't know that I necessarily knew this when I was in university, is that it's the ultimate testing ground for your ideas. I think we have this notion that we spread quite broadly, that when you're at a really, like, high rank university in a really really good program, it is very true that you have access to perhaps things that the majority of the world that is in the educational system does not have access to, and that is very true. I think people take that to be the implication that, okay, well, I'm at Stanford, I'm in this amazing program, and I have access to all these amazing employers, this incredible network, really smart people that I work with and can learn from. So now the pressure is on. Now the pressure is on for me to figure out, like, nail down at the end of my program exactly what I want to do. Um, and I felt this way as well. I feel like there is this pressure, but really my big learning that I would love for folks here on this call kind of to walk away with is that the reality of the situation you kind of learn is that you learn more about what you truly get fulfillment out of and what you really get motivation out of and what you really want to do more through a much longer learning process, because your career is something that you will be participating in for something like 40 years, like between the ages of like 20 something to 60 something. 40 years is a very long time. And if you're in it for the long haul, which is if you're thinking about your career in terms of like a successful arc over this 40-year period, as opposed to just, do I have the most amazing, sexiest, like, job right out of the gate from university? Those are not always the same things. It's like you having just something that looks amazing right out of the gate from university does not guarantee that you'll have a fulfilling, actually successful, like, massively like illustrious career. Those are not at all the same thing. Some of the most successful people in the world actually find their motions several years into their career. And so my advice would be, as you're thinking in MS&E, it's like this is the part where you want to do some really deep reflection on what it is that brings you joy and fulfillment. And within the options, within the constraints that you operate in, which one could help you get closer to that, irrespective of whether that is perceived as something that is really sexy, like really, really illustrious, or not. Because this is your testing ground. This is where you can actually, when you're in your like early 20s, when you're 20, 21 years old, 22 years old, if you make a mistake, if you decide to take up a job that you kind of had a good feeling about, and 1 year down the line you discover actually that wasn't for me, um, this is the time to make that mistake. Because I can tell you, when you're at 40 and you decide this is not really the job for me, you've built up 20 years of momentum around a certain type of profile, a certain set of skills. It's not going to be easy for you to just pivot at age 41 and be like, hey, okay, this is actually, I just decided I'm going to do something else altogether because that wasn't for me. So this is the time you want to do some deep reflection on what perhaps gets you motivation and joy. It's okay to make mistakes very early on because it'll be easy for you to navigate your career early on. It's like no one, no recruiter, no company holds it against you if on your profile you have, 1 year of consulting experience, and 1 year of consulting experience into it, you figured out actually consulting's not for me. I kind of want to work in tech. No recruiter at your age 25 is going to hold that against you. It's like you don't really know what you want and what you'd like and what you don't like at the end of college, and that's okay. And I think your first few years is the process of learning, and that learning is going to set you up for much more success um, over this 40-year time frame, which is, in my view, what you really want to do. It's like if you're going to be in this for the long haul, you want to play the long game. And this is my biggest advice that I give to people. And it's kind of tough advice because you feel like, what does that mean for me now? Is this person saying that I should go ahead and make those mistakes voluntarily? I'm like, let your gut make a little bit more of the decision making rather than what everyone else is telling you to do. Because if your gut is wrong, um, you can actually take that learning and apply it. But if you just like, easily just like cut and copy and paste what someone else is telling you to do, and you do it and you don't file fulfillment, it's hard to pull out of it. If you really stick with it for a long haul, it's much harder to like pivot out of something after you found a niche, which is, by the way, what a lot of the workforce will try to get you to do. Outside of say necessarily like small startups, you oftentimes find yourselves working in certain niches. So the way that you can think about your career is that every job is teaching you about every other job that you will have in your life. So be observant, pay attention, and keep learning. It's like, suppose you take up a job and you know right away within the first 6 months that this is not actually the job for me. I don't see myself doing this long term. That's totally okay. What you want to look for is like, okay, let me parse this out and think about this one level deeper. Out of this 100% of the time that I spend doing this job, what is the 60% that I don't really like? And what is maybe the 40% that I do like? What is it about that 40% that I like? And what is it about that 60% that I don't like? because that what you're doing there is you're synthesizing your learning, you're synthesizing and generalizing your thoughts on what you like and what you don't like. And what you learn is, okay, actually, when I look at them, I'm just using examples here. It's like, actually, I like 40% of my job. And when I wrote down all the things that I like about my particular job or about even my degree, this applies to education as well, the courses you take. What do I like about this course? What I like about this course is that, it's got a huge element of working with people in it. Huh. I wonder, let me stick with it and see if I try to increase, say, the amount of time I work with people, does that give me more job fulfillment or does that give me less job fulfillment? And perhaps you may find that actually it gives you more job fulfillment. And now what do you have? Now you have this learning that actually, you know, even though I was in this not so amazing job for 1 year, what I did learn is that I do like working with people. So when I do get out of this job, I'm now going to look for something that requires me to do that more. And so what you do is you accumulate these kind of learnings constantly over time. And you do that over like the first few years out of your university, and you can take those learnings and then apply them. And I feel like those are way more powerful and potent and not very popular in terms of opinions. I feel like all you read about on the internet is like, HBR articles and Inc magazine and like, these like career coaches telling you about like start this startup and like do this thing and blah blah blah. And it's like, I don't, that's an approach that works for one out of maybe 1,000 people. Statistically, you being one out of those 1,000 people is just mathematically does not add up. So it's okay to take a slightly slower but a more comprehensive approach where you know yourself a little bit better. I would say we could wrap with just like two final thoughts. The unknown is full of risks and opportunities both. Hone your skills and you'll be able to navigate it. And then the last one is we have more information available to us than humankind has ever had at our fingertips. Literally, you have supercomputers in your pockets. Utilize this privilege, is what I tell a lot of people.